Great, thank you all for being here this morning. So as you heard, I'm Steve Miller. I'm with Cigna and Express Scripts. I'm a kidney transplant doctor, and I tell you that mainly because it has relevance to what we're doing today. So if you remember back in the 60s, when dialysis was becoming really common, there was essentially no way to pay for it. If you think about the cost of dialysis at the time, there was a big burden. And so when the country under Nixon was considering the end-stage renal disease bill, they actually took a dialysis patient to Capitol Hill, and they essentially told Congress, if you don't fund this, we're going to unplug this person will die in front of you. It was somewhat dramatic and, of course, a bit not real. But the Congress debated the end-stage renal disease bill for about 15 minutes. And they passed a bill when they were told that only 14,000 people would ever be on end-stage renal disease treatment. And as you know now, there's over 400,000 people that get treatment through the government program. And so the government was fooled once, and you would think, well, they're not going to do that again. They're not going to cover a disease. But then, if many of you remember in the 80s with the AIDS epidemic, the cost of treating an AIDS patient was often over $250,000 a year. And the federal government actually stepped up, and they passed the Ryan White Title IX plan, which would fund the treatment for HIV. And again, that ballooned to a level that they never anticipated. So the government has been fooled on several occasions to be the backstop for expensive disease therapy. And the question is, are they going to step up a third time when it comes to gene therapy? And my assessment is, don't count on it. Fool them once, shame on you. Fool them twice, shame on me. And so I think what you're going to see is we're in a very interesting time. And you saw Tim had some of these headlines. This is really, really exciting stuff. And we, as a medical community, need to make sure these products get into the hands of patients. But when you think about the excitement on the good, the scientific greatness that this is going to represent for patients, on the bad side is how are we going to afford it? And so when you think about the U.S. healthcare system, we spend about $3.5 trillion on an annual basis. It's an inconceivable amount of money. And the question is, can we fit this into the budget? And I actually am a real optimist. With $3.5 trillion, we don't have a lack of money in the U.S. healthcare system. We may allocate that money poorly, but we actually have in this country more than enough capacity to pay for these new products to come to the marketplace, especially when you consider that all the studies show that about a third of that is wasted. So we're wasting over $1 trillion on an annual basis, and I will guarantee you that gene therapy is not going to get to $1 trillion of cost. And so the reality is there's enough money in the U.S. healthcare system. We just got to figure out how do we drive out that waste and how do we pay for the things that we want. And Michael alluded to this before, but I want you to have the perspective of the payer community, especially when it comes to drugs. If you look at the donut on the left, in 2016, the United States was spending about $350 billion on an annual basis for pharmaceuticals. And if you look at the light versus the dark represents patients on specialty medications. That's 1 to 4% of the population, depending on your plan. That 1 to 4% of the population was using a little over a third of the dollars. You fast forward to 2019. In 2019, we spent $480 billion on pharmaceuticals. That 1 to 4% of the population had not changed. There's still 1 to 4% of a plan's population, but they're now accounting for almost 50% of drug spend. So for 4% of the people, we're spending 50% of the dollars. For the other 96% of the people, we're spending 50% of the dollars. This is what has plan sponsors concerned. It's this rapid rise of specialty spend. And as Michael pointed out, I don't care if it's 100% of healthcare spend if it cured people. There's not a right or wrong number of how much we should be spending on drugs. We want to spend on the right things to do the right things for patients. But this is how plans are looking at it, is their spend's going up dramatically, and if you look at what the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry is doing, everything you're bringing to the marketplace, for the most part, is for a rare disease. The business model has totally flipped. Prior to 2010, most of the FDA approvals were traditional oral solid drugs, diabetes, hypertension, osteoporosis. After 2010, the model had flipped where almost all the approvals at the FDA are now for rare and orphan diseases. And so as you see on this slide, the number of those treatments keeps going up, and the price point that they come to the marketplace keeps going up. In the last 2 years, there has not been a single cancer product introduced in the marketplace for less than $100,000. So when you tell the marketplace, oh, we price this based on the value of our drug, our R&D costs, our production costs, well, it's amazing that everyone seems to have the exact R&D costs, production costs, discovery costs. And so we need to make sure that we're explaining to people how this is. And here's the worst case. This is all the gene and cell therapies that have been introduced worldwide. And I want to explain a couple of them. So some of them, many of you in this room will have heard of, but most of the population hasn't heard of. If you look at the far left, Glybera for lipoprotein lipase dystrophy, introduced in Europe at a price that was equivalent to about $1.6 million per patient. Now, it wasn't the greatest therapy, but it worked. And they set up centers of excellence, many of the things you all are thinking of. They tried to get the European patients to come to just a few centers. It turned out the payers didn't want to pay for it, and the product failed. It's no longer available. Second product introduced in the market is Strimvelis. Strimvelis was also introduced in Europe. It's for SCIDs, severe combined immune deficiency. Again, not the greatest product, priced a little bit lower. But what you see is, again, the payers wouldn't cover it, and this product has also failed. And so the first two introductions of genes and cell therapies in the world actually were failures. Now, in the United States, we've had 3 products introduced, Luxturna, Kymriah, and Yescarta. And so far, these products are succeeding. But what I'm here to say is we have got to work together because we owe it to patients and to families to make sure these products get into the marketplace and that they survive in the marketplace. So working together, we're going to have to figure out what can we learn from these failures and what can we do differently in the United States that is going to make these products be successful. And we'll talk about a few of these products as we go a little further. And as you know, and as Tim already said, the science is unbelievable. You know, when I was in medical school, none of these terms were being used. None of them. You look now, and we're coming up with new classes of therapy on a frequent basis, and these therapies are just spectacular. And so we are at the time where we can actually make a huge difference. And you look at these numbers, these are actually drugs that are in either phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. So these are in humans today. And that number is not insubstantial. You're talking about over 1,000 products of advanced type therapies that are in clinical trials in the United States today. And so when you think about what you as a biotech or pharma company and what I as a payer need, we have a lot of overlap. We are not at the opposite ends of the spectrum on this. We actually all need to figure out how are we going to take care of access so we get people on these drugs in a timely fashion. How are we going to take care of affordability? What's the clinical care going to be? And how do we help steward these patients to the best outcome? If we're going to be paying for the drugs and paying these high prices, how do we get the maximum outcome that we can from these? And so you and I are actually quite aligned in this. And we have developed a lot of tools to support you in successful commercialization. So Michael talked about the big players. I'm a really big player. Our company, between Cigna, Express Scripts, and Evacor, we touch 160 million lives in America every year. So when you talk about our population and the influence we can have to make sure these things get into the hands of patients, we actually can not only influence it for a lot of patients, but we need to build the infrastructure that makes this work. So Michael talked about some of the tools that we have, and I'm going to use some case studies. But we've set up a model that we think is unique in the marketplace. Number one, it's on the foundation of specialized clinical care. We are possessed that these patients not only need to have the best care prior to the gene therapy, but they need to have the best care going forward, because we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So we've created what we call therapeutic resource centers. These are centers of specialized excellence where we have pharmacists, nurses, social workers, dietitians who specialize in the diseases that we're treating. And so if you think about if your child had cancer, God forbid, you would take your child to the best pediatric oncologist you could find. why would you want your pharmacist or your social worker or your nurse to be any less well-trained? You would want them to have access to the best care possible. And so we've created this, and we've created it across 23 different diseases. We have it in bleeding disorders. We have it in cardiovascular, diabetes, other things. We have a specialized gene therapy therapeutic resource center where our people are trained just to handle the gene therapies. The second, for the payer communities, they're going to want a second opinion. Now, many times your patients are actually going to be in the very best center they can be in anyway. And so you're wondering why they want the second opinion. It turns out reinsurance often won't even pay without a second opinion. And so it has to be a service that's available that can be quickly obtained to make sure that the patient's getting the right recommendations. Third is we have got to manage the drug costs. And we'll come back to this because this is a big issue. What should your drug be priced at, especially if you want certainty of payment? If you think about it, as a company, many of you who've never commercialized a product, your number one issue is going to be certainty of payment. That's what failed in Europe. They did not have certainty of payment. And if you can't make sure you're going to get reimbursed, it's going to be very hard to dispense that product. And finally, we're going to have to figure out what we call financial protection. What does that look like? How are we going to make sure that individual plans can afford this? Part of the problem with this is that if you think about the bucket, we talked about the drug spend last year was $480 billion. Gene therapy actually can fit into that bucket pretty well. Let's just say gene therapy was 10% of it. It was $4.8 billion. You all would love to have a $48 billion industry. We should be able to fit that in the bucket. The question is, how do we do it? Because part of the problem is that your diseases are not evenly spread across the population. You're going to have families working that are covered by a particular company, and you're going to see headlines even this summer. We have a family who has 3 people with the same orphan disease. A couple of years ago, there was no treatment for them. Treatment comes out, it's $1.5 million per patient per year. Now, unlike a gene therapy, it's an ongoing treatment that they're going to need for the rest of their life. That company, that small employer, now has $4.5 million of new expense. That small company has a choice. They may go out of business, or they may kick everyone off insurance and push them out to the exchanges, because they can't survive this. And this is going to be the same story you're going to see with gene therapy, because it's not going to be evenly distributed, so we got to figure out what does financial protection looks like. So let me give you a couple of examples. Sparks is here with us on the panel, but we work very closely with Sparks, and this will get to some of the tools that we've created in the marketplace to help make sure we can hold down the costs. So you know that they treat a disease called Leber syndrome. It's a very unfortunate disease. Child's born with normal vision. The vision deteriorates over time. If the doctor diagnoses the disease, which is not easy to do, if you get to the right doctor, you diagnose it, the doctor can actually treat this disease with a gene therapy that's injected into the back of the eye, and it stabilizes the vision. Now, it's not supposed to improve the vision, it's supposed to stabilize the vision, but I will tell you, having treated these patients, we're seeing some remarkable results. We've had a young woman who couldn't get a driver's license. She's now gotten a driver's license. I mean, it's truly life-changing for these patients. If you think about what's the challenge Sparks had to get this drug into the OR to treat these patients. If they sold it to the hospital would take their $425,000 drug per eye, and they'd mark it up to $800,000, because that's what hospitals do with drugs, is they mark them up. What we did for Sparks is we developed a delivery model where we could actually deliver to the OR with a patient-specific label, and the hospital never takes it into inventory. That way, Sparks gets all the value for the innovation that they put into it. The hospital has agreed to accept the product through our specialty distribution to their OR, and this way we're able to hold down the costs, improve the care, and make sure that there's more certainty of payment. So this is actually one of those innovative things where we've built a model that is different than what's in the marketplace. And it's because we have these specialized pharmacies, we have specialty distribution, and so we're able to do things above and beyond. And like Michael said, we can now annuitize payments, we can do lump sum payments, we even believe we can add portability over time. I want to use a different example. This is not a gene therapy, but this is an example of, you all heard about the migraine drugs that came to the marketplace. Huge breakthrough for those patients with migraines. As you know, this affects a huge part of the population. When Amgen was going to come out with this product, they initially floated a price out there that was quite high. We went out to visit Amgen. We said, listen, if you do that, the trouble is that payers are going to erect barriers just like they did for the PCSK9s. You may want to come in at a lower price because then you have fewer barriers. And Michael touched on this point, but I've got to reiterate this. How you price your drug, your introductory price, will actually result in how much barrier people put in front of you. And so they actually lowered the price. They brought it out at a much lower price, but they went on to also guarantee the outcome. If the patient didn't respond to the therapy, at least with us, we were going to refund the money to the patient, to the plan sponsor. And so this was a guarantee that the product worked. So not only did we get an attractive price, we got a money-back guarantee for the product when it didn't work. And so this actually, if you look at their launch and how successful it is, unlike the PCSK9s that fought for access and didn't get to many of the patients they wanted to get to, these products are being rapidly adopted and patients are benefiting from it because it's working for both the plan sponsors, the patients, and Amgen. As you know, the Avexis product is soon to launch. You've heard price proposals out there is up to $4 million. We don't know exactly what their price is going to be. We've been working closely with them. We're trying to come up with innovative models to help them launch this. But this is going to be a particular challenge for everyone in this room. This product's going to be very expensive, but unlike most products, these kids are on a clock. As you know, if you don't treat these kids early in life, they actually go on to die. There's a 100% mortality rate by 2 years. But the drug, because of the trials, they treated these patients in a fairly narrow window. And so every day you wait, the patient becomes a little less eligible for the product. And unfortunately, there's only 400,000 kids that are born with this each year. 400 kids born with this each year, but half of those kids are covered by Medicaid. That means you have 50 states. And one of the points you got to understand is when you come to market, you're dealing with 3 different payer systems in the United States. You're dealing with commercial, you're dealing with Medicare, and you're dealing with Medicaid. And you have to have a strategy that is specific for each of those payers. Now with Medicaid, it's even worse. It's not one program, it's 50 programs. And so you're going to have kids that are born who are identified who have spinal muscular atrophy. You're going to be on a clock, which if you don't get approval for the payment in a certain time, the kid's no longer going to be eligible for the treatment. And so you could imagine the newspaper and the watch that's going to be going on for these kids. And this is going to actually put increased scrutiny on all of us in this room. Because the question is, are we heartless people that aren't just care about the money, or are we going to make sure the kids get access to these things? Because this may potentially be curative for life. And so this is really an exciting therapy. And so obviously the higher the price, the bigger the problem. But the company also has very few patients to amortize this over. And so we are going to have to figure out how to solve this together. Which gets me to the next point, and that is, how do you price your product and how do you value your product? As we said, we believe that in oncology, everyone's pricing at over $100,000. Their developmental costs, their discovery costs aren't equal, yet they're showing no price discrimination. And so if you want payers to actually be accepting to your products, how do you actually come in with a story and statistics, numbers that actually show what the value of that product is? There are several different organizations that do this around the world. NICE is very clear, and the interesting thing in Europe is when NICE says they're not going to cover your product, they just don't cover the product. And so it is not much of a negotiation. They essentially are price setting, and they've been successful doing that. Now, they don't give you access to everything in Europe. If you look at cancer products, many of those cancer products that we cover in the United States don't get covered in Europe. And patients who have money come to the United States to get those therapies. Is that going to be the same thing that happens in gene therapy? Are they going to choose not to cover them and let people who have resources come to another country to access them? In the United States, we've seen the development of something called ICER. ICER is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They have been doing modeling and trying to put cost effectiveness on the products. What I'm asking you to do is, as a community, you all have got to figure out a framework. I would love to see a framework which the whole community could agree to. Because if you do that, I can probably help you with certainty of payment. But until we have that, it's going to be really hard to be able to tell you I can give you certainty of payment. And so we can probably get the payer community there if there was some convention by which we all looked at how to value these things. But the haphazard approach that we're taking today is probably going to not be workable, and you're going to see a lot of controversy in the marketplace. I'm going to end here with the following thoughts, and that is these breakthrough treatments are really game changers. We have got to be as innovative on the payment side as you all are being on the science side. And so that's why we're trying to build infrastructure that's going to help you be successful at commercializing these things. But there are going to be no easy answers to this. I know that we have the financial resources in this country to pay for it. I am totally committed to the fact that we can actually do this. We have just got to work together to do this, and you all are going to have to do something painful on your side too, and that's not just to innovate on the science. You're really going to have to think about how you want to price these things, and you're going to have economic models that make it work, and if we're committed to doing this together, I believe that we can be successful to provide access and patient care. So thank you very much.